Okay. For the second video, we're going to talk about the cardiac cycle. There's a lot of stuff. I'm going to go through and explain it all. We're going to talk about the pressure changes within the heart, dealing with the left atrium, left ventricle, and then within the aorta. We're going to talk about volume changes, mostly just within the ventricle. That's what this line is. We're going to talk about some of the important stages that happen within the cardiac cycle. Most of this is focusing on what happens within the left ventricle. We're going to talk about some of the heart sounds that you can hear when you use a stethoscope and you listen. We're going to talk about pressure volume loops after then talking about all of this. So hopefully wrap everything up in a nice little ball. Okay, so first thing, talk about pressure changes. So as blood is returned, I'm going to draw in our pulmonary veins. Pulmonary veins will passively fill up the atria, which will then leak into the ventricle. And so that stage of the cardiac cycle is called rapid inflow, because the ventricle doesn't have a whole lot of anything in it, so blood is just going to go into the atria and just right in. And so that's this time. You have this peak of volume increasing within the left ventricle. And another really important thing is, so the valves, so this valve, which is your mitral valve, and this valve, which is the aortic semilunar valve, those open and close depending on pressure differences between atria and ventricle and the aorta. So if the pressure is higher in the ventricle than it is in the atrium, the mitral valve would be closed, but in this case, because the pressure in the atria is higher than the ventricle, it's open. So, important thing to know. So this is why here, this green line, we're going to write that here. This one right here represents left atria pressure. And this purple line represents left ventricular pressure. So atria is higher pressure than the ventricle, and then at this point right here is when the atria starts to contract. So the left ventricle will passively fill around 70% full of blood, and the atria will contract, so both will increase pressure. Atria will contract just to top off the ventricle, and then the ventricle's pressure will exceed the atria, and so your mitral valve will kind of just go like this, and then it's going to stay shut. And so this right here is the beginning of what we call systole. We're going to write that right here. And so systole is when the ventricle starts to contract. And so you can see it by this huge increase in pressure. So the ventricle is starting to contract, but the pressure within the aorta is still higher, shown by this red line here. Aortic pressure. So the pressure in the aorta is still stronger than the ventricle, so that valve is still closed. Once the ventricle, actually I'm going to write in here with blue, we're going to write right here, mitral valve closes once that pressure increases. Here, once the pressure in the left ventricle exceeds that in the aorta, it is able to force blood through, it's fine, force blood through the aorta. And that's right here. So, aortic semilunar valve opens. And so the time in between when the ventricle is contracting but no movement of blood is happening, this is called, I'm going to write it up here. So isovolumic contraction. So the ventricle is contracting, starting to push blood out, but its volume is not changing, as shown kind of like this little flat area that I tried to do. I'll extend that a little further, like out to here, so. Okay. So then the pressure within the ventricle is going to exceed that within the aorta, and it's going to start pumping blood through. And then at a certain point, the pressure in the aorta is going to exceed the ventricle. And so this is when our semi-lunar valve closes. So that closes, and then the pressure within the ventricle is going to drop because its pressure has dropped a ton. At which point its pressure is going to drop below the pressure within the atrium, and then that mitral valve is going to open. So we're going to write here, mitral valve opens. And so systole is the time in which the ventricle is contracting. So once the semilunar valve closes, the ventricle is no longer contracting because it doesn't need to push blood out anymore. And so that's when systole ends, and when diastole starts. And diastole is also happening over here. So systole, heart contracting, diastole, heart is relaxing. Really important thing right here to notice. This is called the dicrotic notch. Dicrotic notch. So what happens is we have the ventricle pushes a bunch of blood into the aorta. The aorta has a lot of elastic tissue, and so it kind of expands as it deals with that huge rush of blood, because the blood is also pushing against the rest of the blood that's been pushed to the rest of the body. And so the aorta expands and then kind of goes back. And that's where you've got this drop in pressure as the aorta expands, and then this increase in pressure as the aorta gets back to its normal size. So there's our pressure. Those are the pressure changes within the heart on the left side as you have filling of the ventricle, ventricle contracts, pushes blood out into the aorta, and then stops, and then ends up being passively filled by the mitral valve again. This period of time in between the semilunar valve closing and the mitral valve opening is called isovolumic relaxation. So that's when the volume within the ventricle isn't changing, but the pressure is. And the ventricle is relaxing because it's no longer pushing against blood to get it into the aorta. So it's relaxing, but neither of the valves are open, so none of the volume within the heart within the left ventricle is changing. Okay, immediately after, once the mitral valve opens, you've had some buildup of fluid in here coming in from the pulmonary veins, and then you have blood very, very quickly filling that in. And so we have this period of this, which is called rapid inflow. Okay, we already talked about volume changes as rapid inflow, slowly filling up, and then we've got it being topped off. I'll show that a little more. Topped off, little drop in volume. Probably just from leakiness of stuff. So this is where it matches up with the atria contracting just to top off that ventricle, and then ventricle contracts, pushing against the aorta, and then overcomes the aorta, pushes blood in, closes, great, and then we have a repeat of that. Okay, heart sounds. This first heart sound is usually referred to as a lub, and the second heart sound is referred to as a dub. This first one matches up with the closing of the mitral valve, and this dub matches up with when the semilunar valve closes and when the aorta is pushing back against the blood and restoring its normal state in that dicrotic notch. So the dub lines up with those two things. Occasionally you will hear a third sound, which kind of sounds more like a snap, and that's the sound of rapid inflow. So blood coming in from the atria, quickly coming into the ventricle, and kind of like that, like a splashing, so snap of the blood hitting against the ventricle. That's heart sounds. Important stages: isovolumic contraction and isovolumic relaxation. You've got the period of rapid inflow. You've got systole, diastole, sounds, and then I also overlaid it on an EKG. You can see here's our P wave when the atria is contracting. You have that period, and then you've got the ventricle contracting, matching up with this, and then the T wave when everything is becoming repolarized, at which point pressure in here is low, pressure in here is higher, but still low, and you've got that passive filling, and then the heart is getting ready to beat again. And so there's our cardiac cycle. We're now going to take these two pieces, the pressure and volume, and we're going to do pressure volume loops, which are really important. Okay, we're going to use black. Well, this is not a great marker. Okay. In the pressure volume loop, we usually only just worry about the left ventricle. So pressure and volume. We're going to do the rest of it in purple. 50 milliliters, 120 milliliters. Okay. So there's our pressure volume loop. This describes the contraction of the ventricle. So the ventricle is passively filling with blood, and then it gets to this point. Here is our isovolumic contraction. Here it overcomes the, so here we can say mitral valve is open, and then here we can say mitral valve is closed. At this point we can say semilunar is open, and then here semilunar closed. So we've got a couple of important things to note on our pressure volume loop. So here the ventricle is being filled, and then it gets to this point. This here, so whatever our maximum volume is, that's called preload. So that's how much blood we've shoved into the left ventricle. As the ventricle slowly contracts, you have this period of time, which is called afterload. And so what afterload is how much force the ventricle has to contract to push against the blood that is already in the aorta. So how much it has to push against that. The way that, like the best way to describe it is like if you're trying to open a door, so you've got a lot of people inside, that's your preload. Your afterload is how many people are on the outside of the door that you're having to push against to open the door. And so even though the semilunar valve is open because you have higher pressure in here, you still have to push against all of that blood that's in the rest of the body. And then we get here, the ventricle has pushed out most of its blood, ends up being 50, doesn't push out all of it. And then your semilunar valve closes because the pressure inside the aorta starts to exceed the pressure in the ventricle, and then it drops, and this is your isovolumic relaxation, and then you start all over again. So here's your preload, afterload. Right here, I'm gonna erase this. So here, this is our ESV, or end systolic volume, or ESP, end systolic pressure. Here, This right here is our EDP or EDV, end systolic pressure or end diastolic pressure or end diastolic volume. So those are super duper important to understand. This matches up with our preload, and then at this point, this is when the ventricle is maximally contracted and it's gotten rid of all of the blood volume that it needs to do to circulate blood throughout the body. If we were to take a line at some point, zero pressure, some amount of volume, and go up this line, match up with this point here, this line describes what we call inotropy. And inotropy is the contractility of the ventricle, or like how strongly it contracts. And so, important thing to know is if I end up changing inotropy, that will change either my afterload or my preload, potentially both, but will most likely just affect preload. Actually, not preload. It will affect my stroke volume. Stroke volume is the difference between here to there. Stroke volume. So if it were to make sense to you, we'll say I decreased my inotropy. So I decreased how much the heart, how strongly the heart is contracting. So you would agree that we're going to say I'm still going to go to the same preload, still going to go to similar amount of afterload, but then I'm going to peak here and then drop and then go back up. And so you can appreciate how I have now decreased my stroke volume. But if I were to increase how strongly the heart contracts, say I go here now, starting here, start here, go over, same thing over here. Now you can see how I've increased my stroke volume. So changing the inotropy of how strongly the left ventricle contracts will change my stroke volume. Another thing that will change stroke volume is my preload. If I put in more, my stroke volume is going to change. If I put in less, I have less stroke volume. If I have a different amount of afterload, that will also change my stroke volume. So I'm going to erase this stuff. Those are going to stay the same. When we change afterload, which is usually just like peripheral resistance or blood pressure, how much there is resisting what you're trying to push out. So I'm going to draw our normal loop. This point right here is when the ventricle is maximally contracted. So I'm going to draw that inotropic line. There we go. That's straight enough. Okay. So if I were to increase my afterload, so how much more force, afterload kind of ends around here, like that max pressure that it has to push against. So if I were to do afterload, so say we're starting here, and now I'm only going here, I'm only able to go here. So then it's here, same there, same volume there. So you can appreciate how I have now decreased my stroke volume. Whereas if I decrease my afterload, still starting, same preload, I'm going here. Oh, sorry, that's not quite what happens. We're not increasing that pressure. We're increasing how high it gets. So it ends up getting like here. stroke volume is now that. Whereas if I were to decrease my apparator, how much resistance there is when I'm trying to push the door out or open that valve. Decrease, go up to the same point, opens, but now I'm going less. So now I go here, and now you can see I have now increased my stroke volume. So changing preload, changing afterload, so how much, like, based off of this inotropic line. So inotropy is how much it contracts. If I have to spend more energy pushing, or more of my force pushing to open the door against what's outside, that means I have less to push out this volume. But if I don't have to push as much energy, I can push out more volume. So changing afterload will change my stroke volume. Changing preload will change my stroke volume. And then as you saw before, changing my inotropy will also change my stroke volume. So all these things are done to change stroke volume, because we have this really important equation. Stroke volume. So cardiac output is equal to your heart rate times your stroke volume. So if your heart rate starts to go down, you can increase your stroke volume, and you can do it by any of these three different ways. You can decrease your afterload, increase your preload, or increase your inotropy. And that's part of the way that we keep that homeostasis of cardiac output, depending on what things we're doing. And so that's pressure volume loops and our cardiac cycle.